Good evening. We've covered a tremendous amount of ground in here in the last few weeks. And I hope that you have got something out of it. This is about the last lesson in the series. We'll move on to something else. I don't know if we'll get done with this tonight or not, but I hope that you've got something out of it. I hope that it's been logical and in order, and I think that it helps me to go back through this and look at some of this stuff for sure. And we spoke about a lot of different things. We spoke about the Bible and what exactly that is. We've talked about the Old Testament and the New Testament, kind of how those work together, messianic prophecy. We've talked about the idea of the Bible being raised according to subject instead of according to chronological sequence. We've talked about sacrifice and what that means, and how throughout time, throughout all the Bible age, sacrifice has been an important part. Talked about how God's relationship with man has changed over time. We talked about the three different dispensations of Bible time: the patriarchal age, the Mosaical age, and the Christian age, and that we're in the Christian age now. We talked about the church being the kingdom on earth, and that the kingdom is a spiritual kingdom, not a physical kingdom, and we're not looking for Jesus to come back and build a physical kingdom on earth. So we spoke about a lot of different things throughout this study, and I hope that you've learned something from it. If you can always go back and look at it again on YouTube or Facebook, if you want to see a lesson again, you can always go back and review that. Tonight we're going to talk about something that I think is important as we get to the end of this study, and that's really about our salvation and baptism and what that is. We're going to talk a little bit about that word specifically, and the idea of what translation means in the Bible. Translation is something that we all have to deal with if you're a student of God's Word, because I don't know about all of you, but I cannot do Greek. I do a little bit. If I was in Spanish, I'd say poquito, a little bit, but that's Spanish, right? Not Greek. So I know a little words in some other languages. I can tell you a few Greek words, half a dozen or so that I'm pretty familiar with. But I'll be honest with you, I can't read Greek. I can get through it if I try really, really hard with an interlinear, but I can't read Greek. I can't speak Greek. So I'm at the mercy of people translating it into the language that I speak, which is English. And if you are familiar with other languages at all, you understand that translating a language, translating is difficult because different languages use different verbiage, different syntax, different sentence structure. So sometimes to try to make something in one language into another language is super, super difficult to do. Matter of fact, even people that translate sometimes will stop and say, well, how do I say that? How do I say that in English? How do I say that? It's difficult. The Bible was translated into Latin really early on by Jerome, and it was a Latin Vulgate, which the Catholic Church still uses the Latin Vulgate to a large extent. And the problem with Latin is there's a whole lot less words in Latin than there are in Greek, so that was a problem. And it was Erasmus who finally put the Greek and the English together, and wasn't long after that we had King James version of the Bible in the 1600s. So that's when the Bible really became English. But we're at the mercy of translators. And translation is one thing. But unfortunately in the Bible, it gets a lot more complicated than that, because we're not only at the mercy of translation, we're at the mercy of something else, and that's called transliteration. And that's something that we need to talk about just a little bit as we move forward in this study. Translation is the comprehension of the meaning of a text and the subsequent production of an equivalent text, likewise called translation, that communicates the same message in another language, right? Translation is the comprehension of the meaning of a text. So in the Bible, that's often difficult, a meaning of a text. You don't just want the words, you want what the words mean. That's hard to do because words can mean a lot of different things, even in our language, right? How difficult sometimes is it to communicate the meaning of what you want to say in a text message, right? I mean, if you text somebody, I love you, what does that mean exactly, right? Does it mean I really like you? Does it mean I love you because I'm related to you? Does it mean I love you because you're my friend? Does it mean I have amorous thoughts about you? What does that mean, you see? It's not just about making it to your language. It's about translating the meaning of the passage into the language. And that's really difficult to do. And that's the translator's job. Translators not only have to translate the words, they have to translate the meaning of the words. And that gets really, really difficult. But it gets more complicated, okay? It gets more complicated. I give you a lot of different biblical examples where this is a problem. But we try to work through that. But the other thing we deal with is transliteration. Now that happens a lot in language, more than you probably know. And I never really was an English guy till I started preaching. I never was a language guy till I started preaching. But when I started preaching, I really got into this etymology, which is like, it's the foundation of words, like where words come from, right? Because if you kind of know where they come from, it gives you a better idea of what they mean. I'll give you an example of that. You often use the word sincere, right? You say, that's an extremely sincere person. Well, what does that word mean to you? It means that they're maybe trustworthy, maybe they're honest, maybe they're caring, right? But that word actually comes from a Latin word, and the Latin word is sincere. And what that word means is it means no wax, okay? And what that came from is because years and years, centuries ago, when people would build furniture, there wasn't such thing as Elmer's glue and wood filler, okay? Centuries ago. And so when you was making furniture, you would use wax to fill the holes in the furniture. And so you would make this table, and if it had all these holes in it, you would fill them up with wax. And you would finish the table, and the table would look really good, but if it's got a lot of holes in it and you just got wax in the holes, when you go to use the table breaks in half. The table's no good. And so there's sincere, sincere, no wax, means it's solid through and through. But see, that word was transliterated into English, and now it's sincere, you see. There's a lot of transliterated words, a lot of them from a lot of different languages. But what happened in the Bible, and I guess we say this, transliteration is a practice of converting a text from one system into another in a systematic way. The reason I bring this up is because we're going to talk about baptism, okay? We're going to talk about baptism. And baptism is a transliterated word. They could have translated the word because it's real simple what the word means. The word means immersion. Would have been real simple to do that. But let's go back to the time, 1600s, right? Church of England, King James, Church of England, Petio Baptist, baptized infants, poured water over their head, sprinkled them, right? Well, can you translate that word into English? Can you translate it immerse? If you're sprinkling and you're pouring water over people's heads? Not really, because if you do, then people are going to be like, why don't we immerse people? Why are we pouring water over a baby's head? Why are we sprinkling them? Why don't we immerse them? So instead of translating the word immerse, they translated the word baptizo. They put English letters on it and made it baptism. Bible's full of this stuff. Because when translators translate a text, they not only want to translate the meaning of the text, they want to translate their meaning of the text. That's where you get in trouble. Okay? I'll give you another example. Word ecclesia. Told you I don't know a lot of Greek. That's one word I know. Ecclesia in the Greek. Ecclesia means assembly. Okay? Should have been translated assembly. But guess what? King James says, no, I don't want it translated assembly. It was a big argument between King James and the people who were translating the Bible, because King James was like, I want the authority to be in the church. So where it says assembly, so it would be assembly in the Bible, should be just translated assembly, the assembly of the Lord's people. King James says, I don't want to translate it assembly because I want the authority to be in the church, which at that point was Church of England. So we're going to make a new word, and then we make a new word. We can define it how we want to define it, and then over the centuries, it carries that meaning. Gets confusing, doesn't it? So what happened is, okay, nobody's immersing in the 1600s. All right? The Anabaptists are going to come along and do that not too long after that. But at the 1600s, nobody's immersing anybody. It's Petio Baptists. We're baptizing infants. We're sprinkling. We're pouring. We're not immersing. So when it comes along to translate it, we can't translate that word immerse. So we're going to make a new word. We're going to transliterate the word into English, and we're going to make it baptism. So that's exactly what we did. Transliteration should not be confused with translation, which involves a change in language while preserving meaning. Transliteration performs a mapping from one alphabet into another. Basically, you just take a word like sincere in the Latin, you make it sincere in English. Take a word like baptizo in the Greek, and you make it baptism in the English. Trust me, if you research most of the words in our language, you're going to find out they're not uniquely English. Okay? They come from another language. They're not uniquely English. So that's something that we see, and it's something that we deal with in our language all the time, even though we don't know it. That's in our language all the time. So baptism means, in the Greek, it means to dip repeatedly. It means to immerse, to submerge a vessel sunk, to cleanse by dipping or submerging, to wash, to make clean with water, to wash oneself, bathe, to overwhelm, not to be confused with bapto. The clearest example, this is really interesting, it's actually a pickle recipe. That's how we know this, because of a pickle recipe. I don't know how many of them made pickles, but Nicander did about 200 years before Jesus, right? Nicander wrote down a recipe. He didn't know they had recipe books that old, did you? That's an old recipe book. That thing's like 200 years before Christ. So they were like going to write down a recipe how to make pickles. So Nicander writes down the recipe, and he says, he uses both these words, bapto and baptizo. And it says, Nicander says that in order to make a pickle, the vegetables should first be dipped, bapto, into boiling water, and then baptized, baptizo, in the vinegar solution. Both verbs concern the immersing vegetables in a solution, but the first is temporary. The second, the act of baptizing the vegetable, produces a permanent change. So we should have just translated that word immerse, because that's exactly what it means. It means to immerse. It means to immerse. So people ask me all the time. They say, Rex, I had water rubbed across my forehead, or I was baptized when I was an infant, or I got water sprinkled on me. And they'll say, was I baptized? And I just say, well, the word means to immerse. So, I mean, you need to make that decision for yourself, right? I mean, but that's what the word means to immerse. I mean, so if you weren't immersed, were you baptized? Well, yeah, I don't know. So I wouldn't think so. So we get into this, and we see in John 3:23, John also was baptizing at an inn near Siloam because there was plenty of water, and people were coming and being baptized. In Matthew 3:16, as soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. At that moment, heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending and alighting on him. It's really interesting in the Bible, I think, that, and it's something I noticed as a kid, when I was reading the Bible as a kid. I started it like most people do. I thought, start in Matthew and read the Bible, right? So that's what I did. And it wasn't long I come to this, we started talking about John the Baptist, right? I was reading through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I kept seeing this John the Baptist, and he was going in the wilderness, and he was baptizing people. And I wasn't very old. and I never was very smart, but I thought, what the heck, you know? Why is this baptism thing coming up? And it's not, I don't see it anywhere in the Old Testament. Why were these scribes and these Pharisees and these religious people going out for John to dunk him in the river all of a sudden? I said, that just doesn't make sense. I mean, I was only about 10 or 11 years old, but I said, I don't understand that. You know, why would people all of a sudden just do that? Right? I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, maybe it makes sense to you, but I thought, that's just really strange. I mean, I just can't imagine these religious rulers going out into the wilderness and saying, oh, I want John the Baptist to put me under the Jordan River. Why would you do that? And so I pondered about that for a long time because, like I said, I'm not a real smart guy. And eventually I started thinking, well, there's got to be a reason, right? Something. So I started looking at Judaism. And I started thinking, you know, was there a parallel in that? Did the Jews, you know, quote unquote, baptize people? And so I started studying on that. It didn't take much studying. And all of a sudden I found out, yeah, they do that all the time. They did that all the time and still do it. And so it wasn't anything new for them because they were used to that. Matter of fact, when you went, a Jewish male would go into the temple, he would go through a bath to clean off, and then he would go through what's called a mikveh, which we would call baptism, but they call it a mikveh. And they were very strict about that. He had to go all the way under the water, even their hair had to go under the water. And they would go through this mikveh before they went into the temple. And then I got studying a little bit about that, and I thought, well, you know, if I was to proselyte, that's what you call it if you become a Jew. You proselyte into Judaism. And so I thought, well, if I proselyted into Judaism, which I really never had any intention of doing, but I thought, if you did that, how would you become a Jew? Right? And then I got to figuring out, well, it's not much different than becoming a Christian. You got to go through this mikveh. And so I thought that's really, really interesting. And so I got to studying about mikvahs and Jewish baptism. And one thing I found out is that the Jews, they believe that you had to be baptized in living water. So this wouldn't qualify in Judaism, okay? Because living water either has to be running water or rainwater. So there's a mikveh in Oklahoma City at the Jewish temple in Oklahoma City. There's a mikveh there. And the way they do that is they catch rainwater on the roof and they run that into that mikveh, and that makes it living water. Now, women in Judaism today, in Orthodox Judaism today, if you're a woman and it's your time of the month, your time for your cycle, you, according to law, Jewish law, not Christianity, but according to Jewish law, a woman that's on her cycle can't even basically be in the same bed with her husband. You can't sit where she sat. She basically has to isolate herself. But when she's done with her cycle, in Orthodox Judaism, then the woman will go to the synagogue and she will go through that mikveh for cleansing before she will go back into her husband. Quite interesting. So anyway, what I found out in all this is that the idea of going in under the water for God is not like unique to Christianity. It's not something that like started with Matthew. It's something that's been around for a long, long, long time. But I think, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but I think Peter says it maybe the best. Peter says that it's the same, 8 souls saved through water. He says the same baptism, same immersion that doth now also save you, not the putting away of the filth of the flesh, because in Judaism, that was a lot of what that was about, was being clean on the outside. Matter of fact, Jesus really criticized them all the time, for he says you're clean on the outside, but on the inside you're dirty. And so it was about being clean, ritual cleansing, what we call ritual cleansing. And Peter says not the cleansing of the filth of the flesh. In other words, it's not taking a bath, but it's the answer of a good conscience towards God. So when we start talking about immersion, we start talking about baptism, we start talking about all that, I think it's important to understand that it's just not something that just poofed on the scene at the beginning of the New Testament. It was around for centuries before it ever come to the point, but now its meaning has changed, okay? But it was the same thing, and I think that's important when we start to look at John's baptism. We'll do that a little bit. John's baptism as opposed to maybe what Christ was doing when he was baptizing. So there's a lot of stuff going on. New word, but it's not a new thing. Word doesn't have the right meaning, but that's okay. Hopefully we understand that now. It's a transliterated word. So there's a lot to think about. Are there any questions? Boy. Yeah, Jennifer. Well, I mean, I think it's more of a ceremonial cleansing now than it is like a bath. But I think at the time of Jesus, the first they went into was a bath. Then the second one they went into was the ritual cleansing. So they had to be clean before, physically outside clean before they went into the second one. And they do that naked. And the rabbi stands on the other side of a wall, and when the woman does it, he makes absolutely sure all her hair goes underwater and everything. Very, very ritualistic. So anyway, it's a different deal. In Acts 8, with the Ethiopian eunuch, it says they gave orders to stop the chariot. Then both Philip and the eunuch went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. The reason I bring these scriptures up is because I want you to see that in the Bible, in the New Testament, they went into the water. There was where it was much water. There was a lot of things to do with water, and it never was poured or sprinkled or wiped. And, you know, especially, I think this is a really good example because, you know, they're in the desert. This is the Ethiopian eunuch is going back, which is really not our Ethiopia we think of, different story. But Ethiopian eunuch's going back, and Philip joins himself, and they're in the desert. And I thought, how easy would that have been? Philip would have said, give me your canteen, I'm going to baptize you, right? But instead, they went until there was water, and they stopped the chariot, and Philip and the eunuch both went down into the water, and he baptized him. I mean, it's really, I want to throw this story in here because I just want to. And so it's really interesting because if you study church history, which y'all know I love church history, and if you study really the Church of Christ, the start of it was Alexander Campbell, and if you've ever been in any of my classes about that, you kind of know the story. But Alexander Campbell was a Petio Baptist. He was Presbyterian, and he was Petio Baptist. He never had been baptized as an adult. He was studying the Greek. He was fluent in Greek. He was studying the Greek. He was trying to do what the Bible said. He kept coming across this idea of baptism. Eventually, the Presbyterians kicked him out, and it was a big process. I can't get it. If you've ever been through my classes, you'll know. But it was quite the deal. But he wound up in this little home church with him and his son, and he finally was preaching one day, and he'd been preaching about this, and none of them had ever been baptized, ever been immersed, okay? I mean, they'd all been baptized, Petio Baptists, baptized as children, and so none of them had ever been immersed. So he's teaching this in this little home church, and he keeps bringing this up, and this one guy says, I want to be immersed. You know? I mean, he finally just come to that conclusion. Studying the Bible, he said, I need to be immersed. And Alexander Campbell was kind of puzzled. He's like, well, how do we do that? Never done that. How do we do it? And so it was really quite the process that he said, do I go in the water with him? Who can baptize him? You know, does it matter who baptized him? Do I need to go in the water with him? Do I need to? So finally, Alexander Campbell, he come to this conclusion, and he hadn't even been baptized yet. And so he takes this guy to this creek. We would call it a creek in Oklahoma because that's our creek. We call it a creek, right, in Oklahoma. So he takes him to the creek, and he puts him down in the water, and he lays on this stone ledge that's over the top of the water, and he actually just reaches down and pushes the guy into the water from this stone ledge. And then that's how he baptized him, because he didn't know, right? I mean, I don't guess it matters, but he was like, how do you do that, right? And then, of course, later on, he was baptized. They were all baptized later on. It became something that they did and something they understood. But it just goes to show you that when you change your belief, you change what you've come to know to be right, it sometimes poses another set of questions that you have to kind of deal with and answer. And you know, I think that's something that I think it's a very interesting story, because it shows people who really wanted to do the right thing, and yet methodology-wise, and the method, they were a little bit, how do we do that? Right? Kind of interesting. But eventually they were all baptized. He was baptized, the son was baptized, and they come to this conclusion. But a lot of that study that he did is probably reflected somewhat in this. In Acts 22:16, as Paul recounts his conversion on the road to Damascus in Acts 9, he says, why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized and wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord. So he was pretty concise about that, you know. That's why I'm baptized, to wash away my sins. That's why I'm baptized. And he recants that in Acts 22:16. In Galatians 3:26 and 27, so in Christ Jesus you are all children of God through faith. And then he says, let me tell you why. That's a Greek word, gar, for, at the beginning of 27, G-A-R, because for is a real interesting word in the Bible. There's 3 different Greek words for for. So it can be, let me tell you why, or because of, right? For can mean a lot. The word for is an interesting word. It can mean a lot of different things, right? Right? So there's different Greek words for. But this is G-A-R, gar in the Greek, which is really interesting, because that means, let me tell you why. Y'all are faith in Christ Jesus, let me tell you why. All of you have been baptized into Christ, have clothed yourself with Christ. Very powerful. I think Galatians 3 is one of the most powerful, probably chapters in the Bible on baptism, although we don't use it much. Well, I use it quite a bit. Most people don't use it much, but I think it's one of the most powerful passages on baptism in the Bible, and the idea of what that means. In Acts 2:41, those who accepted his message were baptized. This Pentecost, beginning of the church. You know, when the church began, and see, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because there's a church here, right? But they were added to that number, weren't they? Added to the number. So if we look at Acts 2:41, which is kind of the beginning, Peter preaches the message. Acts 2:37, they were pierced to the heart, said, what shall we do? Acts 2:38, Peter says, repent and be baptized for remission of sins. You shall receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. For the promise is you and your children and all those who are far off, means the Lord our God will call. You get down to 2:41. It says those who accepted his message, which was Peter's message, were baptized, which was immersed, and about 3,000 were added to their number that day. Now, most scholars believe this is just counting the men. So it was 3,000 plus women. So it was a lot of people. So that was a big deal. I think it'd take a while to baptize 3,000 people, pretty sure. I baptized 6 people at one time. That took a little while. So 3,000 would be a job, I tell you. But they baptized 3,000 that day. But if we jump down a little further in 47, it says, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people, and the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. So if those who are being baptized were added and those who are being saved were added, then saved and baptized and added all have to be equal to each other. So it's kind of interesting, because I wasn't raised this way at all. I was raised Catholic, who baptized babies, and I was raised Baptist, who don't believe baptism is really necessary for your salvation. So just like Alexander Campbell, this was a big thing for me, something I'd never, ever been raised with. This idea, where are you saved? Where does it happen? And it's not just water. I mean, I think that's, and I think we need to clarify that here. I mean, it's absolutely, people say, well, you're a water regenerationalist. In other words, you think it's all in the baptism, but it's not. But baptism is kind of the point where all that stuff that comes together. The idea that you believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God, you're willing to confess that before men, you're willing to turn away from the world and turn towards God, you're willing to repent. And baptism's kind of the final thing in that path, you know. It's kind of the end. It's kind of where things change and where that happens. I think Paul, I don't know if I have Romans 6 in this. I think Romans 6 is, probably don't have it in there. I think Romans 6 is a good, really kind of brings that into play a little bit. In Romans 6, Paul says, so we can continue in sin that grace may abound. And he says, may it never be. Don't you know that you who are baptized into Christ have been baptized into his death? There's a point where you meet that blood. There's a point where you die to this world. And Paul says that's when you're immersed. Don't you been baptized into his death, right? And don't you know that you're going to walk in a new life? And I think that's kind of the crux. That's kind of the point of where things happen. Nobody can add you to this body. No man can add you to the assembly of the saved people. No man can do that. When I was a kid, I was raised, like I said, Catholic. I was raised Baptist. And I know when I was in the Baptist church, and when he would come down, they would vote on you. And no man has the right to do that. Period. It's not my decision. It's not the elders' decision. To join the Lord's assembly, the Lord's body, is your decision and only your decision. And only the Lord can add you to this. Nobody else can add you to this but the Lord, period. No man. This isn't man's body. This isn't man's institution. Jesus Christ died for the church, for the assembly. Let's put that word in there. Because I think when we use that word church, it's so limiting. Because when you and I hear the word church, we think church, building, place, name, don't we? Because that's how we're trained, right? But it's not. And I tell Susie it's time to come. I don't say it's time to go to church. I say it's time to come to the building. Because until we're all here, this is just a building. It's not the church. This is just the building. If we was a meeting at my house, the church would be at my house, right? Just didn't make my house the church. I didn't say that, but the church would be at my house. You see, we need to think that way. We need to realize how that works, how that takes place. If you look at the sign out here, it doesn't say this is the Church of Christ. Look at that if you've never really looked at that. It says Church of Christ. What's it say? Meets here, right? Because this isn't the church. This is just a building. And if the tornado comes and blows this away, the church still exists, right? This is nothing. This is just sheetrock and paint. That's all this is. So we need to think that way. And people will ask me, they'll say, it's really funny. It almost sets me back when people ask this question, but they'll say, what do I need to do to join your church? And I'll say, whoa, let's back up here. Put in some new information, right? Number one, it's not my church, except for the fact that I go here. It belongs to Christ. He died for it. It's his. Number two, since it's his church, his assembly, right? You better ask him how to get into it, not me, because I can't get you in here. Only you can get you in here. But the world doesn't look at it that way, do they? Most of the time. They don't look at it like that. And we need to look at it like that. And the way we speak should reflect that, because we should understand what this is. This is a lot more difficult. We have 3 minutes. So I think we'll do this next Wednesday night. So thanks for your time.